Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Wanted to make a video about Ukraine based on a few people wanted me to make a video. So I figured, I'd kind of give the history or at least, the reasoning of why Russia actually invaded Ukraine in the first place. So it's a little bit more nuanced than what the media has been saying. People have been acting very surprised who haven't been studying the region, the Black Sea region in general, throughout history. So if you didn't know, I did study history in college. It was my major, but now I work in finance. But I still, of course, always read up on this, and I've always been kind of, in the tap of what's going on throughout the 20th century, especially, and then moving into the 21st century, and where America kind of will pivot on a foreign policy basis, moving into this next latter part of the first half part of this century. So I just kind of want to talk about, from the basics of, the United States grand strategy, probably post World War II. What people need to really understand is we've always wanted to kind of promote democracies that promote human rights in the sense because if we have a bunch of governments that support quote unquote human rights, the chances are they won't go to war with us. So the less governments there are that are despots or just dictatorships, chances are they won't go to war with other quote-unquote liberal democracies. So the less there are, the better security we have for the West. So that's always been kind of our strategy moving forward in the 20th century, in the Cold War, and then during the Bush Doctrine era, which was basically nation building that were with countries, struggling with terrorism. So it's kind of enjoining the two thoughts. But, as you can imagine, countries like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, they don't agree with this so much. So they kind of view it as a threat because they are under our crosshairs and we do want them to be overthrown. So by promoting the democracies across the world, this has kind of, made them angry. So I am not surprised when I see Russia trying to put basically Ukraine in its sphere of influence, both because of geography, with economics, and also just trade deals, and just cultural values and norms. It's very similar to Russia. Historically speaking, it's been part of Russia for the most part of the last 1,000 years. So when you have the United States kind of put its thumb on elections, that tends to happen a lot throughout history because we want to promote quote unquote human rights, kind of coalitions. We're going to piss off countries like Russia. So, we saw this in the Orange Revolution in 2004, the Maidan Revolution in 2014. So it should come to no surprise that Putin is a little bit kind of scared or paranoid that we're going to basically enjoin Ukraine with the EU and with NATO. So let's kind of just back up and look at Ukraine as a country. So Ukraine actually does mean borderland in Old Slavic, I believe. So it's where the steppe basically meets Eurasia, or at least Europe. So, if you look at the flag is obviously the sky, and then you have the wheat fields underneath. So I don't know if you knew this, but about a third of the world's wheat derives from this region, from Russia and from Ukraine. So this is going to be really problematic moving forward with wheat prices about to skyrocket this coming year. So that's something to keep our eye on. But the first Russian state, Kievan-Rus, it ruled over the territory from about 880 AD until the Mongols conquered the region in 1237. And the Mongols / Tartars, they ruled until about 1362. And then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth then ruled the area from 1362 to 1667. So again, this is just about a 300-year period where the Russians nor the Kievans ruled the area. So afterwards, it was taken by the Romanovs from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth after the 13 Years' War. So that was in 1667. So from 1667 until 1991, Ukraine was part of Russia. So you can understand why there's a lot of cultural norms. The language is very similar to one another. It's kind of like, Swiss German versus German in general. I know this is one of the reasons why the eastern portion of Ukraine was angered, and as well as Crimea, they were trying to pass basically laws around the time of the Maidan Revolution to basically make Russian as the main state language. And then I know Kiev shot that down, and that was one of the reasons why they were looking to go against, or at least get out of Ukraine. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. So when Ukraine actually did declare independence in 1991, just like many other states that were part of the Soviet Union, they did so kind of just with the understanding that they would be supported by the West, especially when they were going to hand over their nukes. So they had over 1,000 nuclear warheads that were part of the Soviet Union that just so happened to be in their hands because they had bases there. So they felt, it was pretty expensive to maintain because they were already struggling financially, like many of the former USSR countries. They thought they could rely on the West for military support, and then they thought it was just a good act of faith to Russia to basically hand over these nukes just so they could basically have their independence. So this obviously backfired. The West, has not militarily supported Ukraine even since 2014. Yeah, sure, we've sent some equipment, but we haven't, sent troops on the ground. So, why is this? When you look at Ukraine, it's not strategic, at least doesn't have any strategic value for the United States. When we look at our grand strategy, we want to focus on Asia, we want to focus on the Middle East. These are actually vital to what our needs are, when it comes to oil, it comes to, let's just say, like with populations, when we have trade deals, we know Asia is growing exponentially over Europe. Europe it's a waning power. Ukraine is part of that. We're just not looking to actually get too involved. But we are going to, of course, support any kind of democratic coalition that's trying to, get or retain power in any country. So that would be Ukraine included. So, throughout the 90s, 2000s, we admitted a bunch of Eastern Bloc countries into NATO, such as Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Croatia, Czech Republic, Romania, etc. So in 1990, the U.S. Secretary of State, James A. Baker, promised the Premier Gorbachev, so leader of USSR at the time, there would be, quote unquote, no extension of NATO's jurisdiction for forces of NATO 1 inch to the east. And when he's saying to the east, that's east of Germany. Obviously, the West has broken this promise. We continue to push for NATO countries to be added in the Baltic, like I was mentioning, and in the Black Sea region. We even had the Bucharest Convention, or the conference in 2008. NATO told both Georgia and Ukraine that we would welcome their applications to join. So Putin saw this as a direct threat. He invaded Georgia, if you recall, in 2008. So this was during the Beijing Olympics, if you remember. George W. Bush actually responded quite quickly. Being a neocon war hawk, he quickly responded with military threat. He already started deploying troops, and Putin backed down after a 12-day war. So it was quickly ended, and that's basically how it went down. So after 2008, both the EU and NATO continued to push for Ukraine to join the West and remove itself from being a Russian sphere of influence. So this is not a good strategy moving forward, because we know that it has more strategic interests to Russia than it does to us. So Putin is going to continue to support candidates that are pro-Russian, and we're going to continue to support candidates that are pro-Western. So we've been sending intelligence officials to foment dissent against Russian-backed politicians in Kiev. Of course, Putin knows about this. He's angry. We actually fomented a coup to overthrow Russian-backed President Yanukovych. That was back in 2014 during the Maidan Revolution. So Yanukovych was trying to be the mediator between Russia and the EU. The EU wanted to make a trade deal with Ukraine, but they just simply didn't trust Ukraine with a lot of corruption that mires the government and the country itself. So they didn't give them a great deal. Putin actually gave them a better trade deal, which was accepted by Yanukovych. So Putin offered $15 billion in loans and cheaper gas. So it was loans and gas prices would be reduced. So this was 15 billion, and then the EU offered 838 million. So this matter is important. So Yanukovych was now seen as a Russian puppet because he accepted the deal with Putin. So protests began in February of 2014. Yanukovych clamped down overzealously and too hard. So about 60 protesters died in a 2-day span. And then he was forced to resign. New elections were held, and then a pro-Western leader was installed. So we helped foment the dissent, and Putin knew this, and we basically foiled any push for a pro-Ukrainian president to continue to gain influence. So this brings me to Crimea. So the Crimeans were overwhelmingly always, well, at least historically speaking, they overwhelmingly vote for pro-Russian politicians since 1991. You can look at, you can just Google what the election maps looked like in 2010, 2014. Eastern part of Ukraine as well as Crimea, they always voted for the pro-Russian politicians. So Catherine the Great, back in 1783, she actually seized Crimea. Russia has always wanted influence over the area because they want warm water ports. Most of their ports, they're frozen throughout the year. So like St. Petersburg, you can't even, unless you have really, if you're willing to invest in icebreakers, it's going to be a very expensive endeavor. So that's why they always want access to fresh water or just, cold, warm water ports. So this is one of the reasons why Putin was eyeing Crimea. I mean, not to mention the Crimeans, they did actually look to secede. So this was during the 2014 revolution. They were already trying to look to secede. So Yanukovych asked Putin for assistance militarily. They already had troops in the region because they were leasing, I think it was Sevastopol, the port city. So all they had to do was just move the troops and then seize the territory. And, once that happened, it was incredibly important because 2/3 of Ukraine's actual shoreline was removed instantaneously. So this is potentially trillions of dollars of oil and offshore drilling and gas. So very important. The Western and Ukrainian response was pretty tepid, or at least from the sense of military stance, it's very, very light. So in the sense of financial sanctions, we only targeted a few oligarchs and financial institutions, a few companies, nothing really too pertinent to even remember. So Obama was very light with sanctions. We didn't allow a few of their officials in the country. We targeted a few of the people that were close to Putin's inner circle. And like I said, some companies and banks. So the Ukrainian response was to basically cut off the water supply to Crimea. So there's a northern Crimean canal that flows from southern Ukraine into Crimea, and they cut off access to this. And Crimea, if you look at the geography, very dry, swampy, kind of like almost like a dry swamp, if you want to put it that way. Not a lot of water. So they had to create that canal. And then once Putin took Crimea, they shut off access to that canal. So as a result, it's just become a very expensive subsidy trap for Putin. So he had to look for ways to actually, resolve this water crisis. And the latest invasion, that certainly helped get water back into the region and lift at least costs for Putin. So what are the sanctions after what Putin's done this year? So if really this was a game of poker, the West just is simply just playing a losing hand, it seems. We're doubling down on this losing hand. So we're going to try to sanction more, but the Germans even pointed out that, if Russian banks are completely removed from the SWIFT system, so, that's the international system where wiring funds internationally, you have to basically get the SWIFT code, enter the SWIFT code, and it goes directly into an account. Bank of America is the intermediary bank for, at least I know, domestic American wires to Europe. I know it has to go to Bank of America, whatever. So basically, though, if we put on restrictions with SWIFT, there's going to be no way or recourse to pay Russian banks for oil and natural gas. So they've basically played us. How can we we can't sanction them to the point where we can't pay for, the actual energy, natural resources that we need, and that's Europe and that's the United States. We also get a lot of natural gas from Russia and oil. So we need to consider that. I'll get to that later. But, simply put, just Russia has leverage, when it comes to sanctions, because we can't go the full sanction amount that people might want necessary. So they've neutered the power of NATO and the EU because they've just entrenched themselves in dependence on their oil and natural gas. So with sanctions, we've just chosen to double down and increase sanctions on just a few more banking institutions and a few more oligarchs. So nothing really too substantive. Just keep in mind, Russia, like I said, they do produce about, Russia and Ukraine alike, they produce about a third of the world's wheat. So this concerns me a lot. Prices are going to skyrocket in the coming weeks. So Russian trade with China is going to offset basically these sanctions too. So in 2021, the EU made 220 billion, or made up 220 billion in trade versus 146 billion in trade with China. So this is Russian-Chinese trade and Russian-EU trade. So Chinese and Russian trade in 2003 was only 16 billion. So you can see that it was going to be eclipsed coming this year, the following year. So the EU is kind of rendered useless in that sense. So Putin basically calculated, the war was worth the sanctions by relying more on China. So if everything works out, he should be able to offset the losses just by increasing his trade with China. But just keep in mind, there's no pipelines already built from Siberia to China. So Putin's going to have to consider investing in infrastructure to not rely on the West as customers. But where do we basically go from here? Simply put, just Ukraine's not important enough strategically for the United States. They're not vital geographically, politically, or economically. So, Asia, Middle East, those are. Europe is a waning power. They're depopulating, whereas Asia, moving forward in the 21st century, we're going to be dominated by its politics and economic power. So, troops are not going to be deployed. China is loving this because it's going to basically make the importance of NATO even more so. So we're going to have to put resources more so in with NATO and remove them from the areas around Taiwan. So China is, of course, loving this. It's a win-win for them. And the United States just needs to understand that, Russia cares more about this than we do. So they have greater strategic interests, when it comes to Ukraine. So based on just morale and just moral resolve, I think Russia will probably emerge victorious in Ukraine, just either by partitioning half of Ukraine through a peace agreement or just taking Ukraine in general. So they're going to keep it within its sphere of influence. That much I know for certain. The United States just needs to understand, and the West, so that's Europe too, that we're just as culpable as Putin. We when it comes to this war, we continue to poke the bear and act surprised when the bear bit back. We pushed for Ukraine to accept trade deals with the West and join NATO. This was against the wishes of Russia. They repeatedly warned us this throughout the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. And then we act surprised when, Russia is going to make the first move. The chessboard had been set, and they kept moving their pieces, and we just weren't paying attention. If Ukraine can prove, though, to be a quagmire and kind of be like an Afghanistan 2.0 for Russia, that's a win for us because we want them to be bogged down, and we want their actual at least just perhaps we want Putin to be so unpopular that he gets overthrown. So that's always a possibility too. But it's just a shame that we're just pushing Russia into the arms of China. They're already developing a competitor to SWIFT anyway. It's called CIPS. So SIPS. So the sanction will only speed up its integration too if they're going to go that route. So if we get rid of SWIFT for Russia, they're just going to use CIPS, and then that's just going to speed up its integration into world markets. So We need the Russians, though, to actually combat against terrorism across the globe, too. So, like, they align with us from a religious perspective, too. We need the Russians on Syria. We need them on Iran. And again, China just loves that we're diverting all of our resources from Asia to Europe now. So our Asian partners aren't happy about this. They're going to be questioning now, how are we going to be able to protect them? Are we able to protect Japan? Are we going to be able to protect South Korea, the Philippines? When the Chinese took Scarborough Shoal in 2014, did Obama do anything? No. So it's going to be one of those kind of situations where does the buck stop? Where are we actually going to deploy troops? Where does the strategic interest really lie? I'm hoping that we could get some kind of peace deal where Ukraine remains a buffer state and neutral between Russia and the West. But, it's really going to be difficult now that the die is cast, and Putin's actually doing quite well in the war, as much as the media wants to say they're failing. If you look at maps of where Operation Iraqi Freedom was in 2003 versus Ukraine now, and this is in early March of 2022, they're moving faster in Ukraine than they are in a desert in Iraq. So that's something to be concerned about. I mean, if we do get a peace deal, I would hope that it would be partitioned at the Dnieper. So basically half of the country will be in the sphere of the EU's influence. The other half will be in the sphere of Russian influence and be part of Russia. So it's going to be very difficult now that, the glass is broken on the floor. Now we're going to have to basically put these pieces back together. I really don't know where we go from here. It's going to be difficult having to work with, the supply chain crisis that's already happening because of COVID, and now you're going to have rising prices because of this war. So, the Biden administration, they need to try to increase our production of oil, become energy independent. That way, Europe is not relying so much on Russian oil and natural gas. We should view this as an opportunity, but I doubt the administration will see it the same way. They're going to try to push now for more green, energy sources, which is pretty inept, and it takes too long, and it's more expensive. So we're already close to the Keystone Pipeline. We should continue to push for that, and just overall, just the West needs to really take responsibility for what has happened. We kept pushing Ukraine to be closer to the West, and then we just act surprised when Putin actually makes the first move. So thanks again for listening, guys, and I hope I will catch you on another one.